Good afternoon, church. Hello, good afternoon, church. Today's reading is from Gospel of Mark. It's page number 1004. Mark chapter 2, verses from 23 to 27, and chapter 3, 1 to 6. Page number 1004. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the cornfields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some ears of corn. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on that Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the day of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath.'" Chapter 3. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on a Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, or to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn heart, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sophia. Hi everyone, my name is James. It's really nice to see you. Let me pray and then we'll start. Lord God, we thank you for everything you've given us. Thank you that it's even your breath in our lungs. And Lord, would you use my words now? Would you speak through them? I pray that each one of us would come away knowing you more. Amen. Amen. I'm not sure if you've seen any of these adverts recently. Hopefully coming up on the screen. Oh, maybe not. You probably haven't seen these. I can explain the advert if not. The adverts there for British Airways, they're these kind of sarcastic, oh, here we go, kind of sarcastic out-of-office auto-replies you can set on your emails. Someone who's gone away on holiday, set this auto-reply. Here's a second one. I think, are there a couple? I think the reason that I see these adverts is one of my hobbies is going on Google Maps and looking at places that I could go on holiday and then not booking the holiday, but just seeing places that I could go in theory. And I think British Airways are like, give us some money, and so they're targeting me with these adverts. Here's another one. I think there's one more as well. It says, "Hello, I won't be working my socks off this week. I won't be wearing any socks at all. Thanks, Ben." And I quite like looking at adverts. I think the thing I like about adverts is that people who make adverts are some of the best in the world at understanding human nature. If you want to sell something to someone, you've got to understand their nature. And I think that these adverts show us a couple of things that most of us would agree on. One is that work can often be all-consuming, and that's a bad thing. Loads of us work all the time, and we kind of know that's not a good thing. But it's really hard to stop, isn't it? Work can be all-consuming, and that's a bad thing. And secondly, I think these sort of adverts show us that we deeply want rest. It's just often really hard to achieve. Like we deeply want to rest, but that's really hard. I wonder, maybe you've had any of these experiences. I've experienced all of these things. Have you ever sat on the sofa really tired and watched Netflix and ended feeling more tired than when you started? Have you had that where you're like, I think this is going to restore me, and you just like at the end feel even worse? Or have you taken a day off, or maybe the first day of your holiday, and at the end of it you kind of just feel like, bleh. Like you think it will be really restorative, and you're just like, oh, kind of headachy and moody. I'm like grumpy. It's supposed to be my rest time, but I just feel kind of rubbish. Or maybe you've been really tired, you're knackered, so you go to bed early, you lie there, and your brain is just like, and you can't sleep, right? And you really want the rest, but you can't sleep. Often we deeply desire rest, but it's often hard to achieve. And so the question that I want us to explore today is, what insights do the way of Jesus have to this very human experience? We're coming to the end of a section in Mark's Gospel that's been filled with conflicts between Jesus and the Pharisees. Kind of like a round table from the traitors, that people keep throwing accusations at Jesus. Jesus is like responding to these accusations. 4 times in a row, there's been conflict through Mark chapter 2. First when Jesus heals a paralyzed man, then when Jesus calls Levi, then with questions about fasting, and then today's passage with questions about the Sabbath. And all 4 of these passages follow a similar pattern where Jesus or his disciples do something, the Pharisees question it, and then Jesus responds. And in his response, Jesus is using those chances to teach us something about him and who he is. In this passage, it's the Sabbath day, that's the day of rest, and Jesus and his disciples, they're walking through a field, and the Pharisees are watching. We don't know, maybe they're hiding, maybe they're watching quite openly, but Pharisees are watching. And what they see is the disciples picking some grain from a field. And that's exactly what they were hoping to see. And so they confront Jesus and they say, why are you letting your disciples do what's not lawful on the Sabbath day? They're breaking the law. That Sabbath day was the day of rest, and all of Israel is commanded to rest. But it's quite tricky, isn't it, to pin down what rest means? Like, what counts as rest and what doesn't count as rest? Like, is a 10K run rest? Is a spa day rest? Like, probably yes for some of us and no for other ones. So how do you pin down what rest is? And so to try and deal with that ambiguity, the Pharisees created some extra rules to try and define what you could do on the Sabbath. They had this idea of what they call building a fence around the law. So this is the law. I really don't want to break the law. And so I'll build a fence around it so that I don't even get near to breaking the law. And they called this the Mishnah. It was a list of extra rules. And in the Mishnah were 39 rules related to things that you can and can't do on the Sabbath. 39 extra rules, more than just observe the Sabbath. And one of those rules was not reaping, not picking wheat or grain or anything else. And so the disciples picking this corn and eating it was breaking the Mishnah. And the Pharisees think they've caught Jesus out. And Jesus responds with 3 things. We see them in our passage. He responds with a story from the Old Testament and then 2 big statements about who he is. The interplay between these 3 things that he says is kind of confusing, but here's what I think is going on. The story that he tells, you can see it there, is from 1 Samuel 21. David and his followers are on the run from King Saul, and they're hungry. They come across a priest, and the only food that the priest has is bread that's been consecrated, which means dedicated to God. And in verse 26, you can see Jesus explains, that bread is only lawful for priests to eat. So it will be breaking the law for anybody else to eat the bread apart from the priests. But because David is hungry, he eats the bread, and he gives some to his companions too. And then Jesus jumps straight from that story to these 2 big statements. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. And as a reader, you're kind of like, what was that about David? So you tell a story about David, and then suddenly, how do we get to this? It's kind of confusing. But I think that there's 2 things going on, taking us from the story about David to these 2 big statements. Firstly, Jesus is saying that David's need for food came above the law. Yes, the law meant that the bread was only for the priest to eat, but David and his companions were starving. The law is not there to force people into starvation. That's not the point of the law. And that's the springboard into the first statement. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He's using the story to show that point, to illustrate it. The word man that's used in the NIV is the Greek word that just means people. And so another translation would be the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. The Sabbath doesn't exist to force people into suffering or starvation or anything else. That's not the point. The Sabbath exists for people, not the other way around. And then secondly, Jesus is using the story to show that David's authority allowed him to eat the bread and to give it out to his companions. In both the stories, so the one about Jesus and his disciples and the one about David and his companions, there's a leader, either David or Jesus, and their followers, the disciples or David's companions. And in both stories, it's the followers who get the food. How is it that David's disciples, David's followers, get to eat the bread that only priests could eat? It's because their leader, David, had the authority to give it to them. He's God's chosen king, right? He's the anointed king, and so his authority allows him to give the bread to his companions. How is it that Jesus' disciples get to eat the corn? It's because Jesus, their leader, has the authority to give it to them. And that springboards into the second statement, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is claiming some sort of authority. And so the story that Jesus tells, I think, really is driving us towards these two big ideas, which is where we'll focus on for most of today. The Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. And the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And for us to fully understand what that means, we really need to understand what the word Sabbath meant if you were listening at the time. If you were a Pharisee or a disciple, what does that word Sabbath mean? And so we're going to do just a brief Old Testament theology of the Sabbath so that we can see what it meant when Jesus said it, so that we can see what it means for us today to hear these two statements. If we go back to the Old Testament, we'll see that the Sabbath is really old. That's the first thing to see. It predates the Ten Commandments, it predates Israel, predates Abraham, predates even the fall from Eden. The Sabbath was there right at the start of creation. For 6 days, God creates. He spends 6 days creating the world, adding layers and layers to his creation. And then Genesis 2 tells us this. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he'd done. The picture of rest here is not that God is really, really tired from all his work. It's not that he's had a really busy week, although obviously making the world a pretty busy week, like he's had a busy week, but the picture is not that he's such a busy week that he's tired. Instead, the picture is that God is delighting in the work that he's done. Genesis 1 ends by telling us that what God has made is very good. And if that's by God's standards, then very good means it's seriously good. Like what God has made is seriously good. And now, God is stopping to enjoy it. In the creation narrative, God blesses three things. He blesses animals, he blesses humans, and then he blesses a day. The seventh day is blessed and made holy by God. It's designed to be good. Last summer, I was probably being naive, but I decided to relay the floor in our kitchen. Our old floor was quite kind of grubby, and it got dirty really quickly. We probably didn't clean it enough, but that's a different story. It was hard work, right? It took me a long time. I'm an economics teacher, which I discovered has very little transferable skills with being a carpenter. So it took me a long time to do. I worked hard. But at the end, I had this nice new floor, and it was much cleaner and smoother, and it looked better than our old floor. And before we brought in the kitchen table and chairs, me and Joey, we sat down on the floor. We ordered pizza, we poured some wine, and we just sat on the floor and enjoyed it. What we created was good, and we enjoyed it. That's the picture of God resting. Not a burnt-out, exhausted God, but a God who is rejoicing and delighting in what he has created. That Sabbath was created as a rhythm for God's people long before the people were given any laws to live by. It's been a rhythm since the very start. But when Israel were given the Ten Commandments, one of them is the Sabbath. And this is what I said about the Sabbath. This is Exodus 20, 10 Commandments. Commandment number 4 says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And we see a couple of things when the Sabbath is made into law. The first is that the Sabbath is radical in scope. Adults and children, servants, non-Israelites, the foreigners living in your towns, even animals. The Sabbath is made for everyone, not just a select few, not just the holy ones, but it's made for everyone. It points forwards to Jesus saying in Mark 2, the Sabbath is made for humanity. And then secondly, we see that the reason that the Israelites are given for observing the Sabbath is rooted back in Genesis. If you look at the last part, it says, for in 6 days God made the worlds, but he rested on the seventh day. And the idea is that you should do likewise. Follow God's pattern. He worked for 6 days, rested for one. Follow God's pattern. And God designed the world to be lived in this rhythm. Work, followed by rest and delight. Work, rest and delight. I think that often we want to bypass part of the rhythm. We want to just skip the rest. We're happy to work, but then we want straight to delight. Work and then straight to delight. Work and then straight to delight. So we work longer and longer hours, and we have shops that are open more and more of the day, and we can shop all night as well if we want to. We buy expensive holidays for people who are desperate to get a break. But that's not the rhythm. The rhythm is work and then rest and delight. Work, rest and delight. The Sabbath commandment points us back to that rhythm that's been there since the very beginning of the world. As the world was created, that rhythm was put into place. But you might not know this, the Israelites were actually given the 10 Commandments twice. So once in Exodus, but then also a second time. The book of Deuteronomy literally means second law. Deuteronomy is kind of like a retelling of the law. It's basically a sermon. It's 34 chapters, so it's quite a hefty sermon. But basically Moses is like re-preaching the law back to a new generation of Israelites. And in Deuteronomy, the 10 Commandments are delivered again. Deuteronomy 5, Moses retells the 10 Commandments. This is what he says about the Sabbath. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. So far, it's almost exactly the same as the last time, right? Exodus 20. Almost exactly the same commandment. Rest, you and all of your people, all your animals are supposed to rest. Observe the Sabbath. But this is the really interesting thing. In Deuteronomy, the reasoning that's given is different. We have the next slide. This is the reasoning. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So same command, observe the Sabbath, but this time it isn't rooted in the creation narrative, but the Exodus story. Here, the way that we're asked to understand the Sabbath is through the lens of freedom, particularly freedom from slavery. You used to be slaves, and you had no choice but to work and work and work for Pharaoh, who wanted more and more and more from you. But now you're free. Now you're not a slave. You have the freedom to stop for 1 day a week. And when you stop and rest, remember that you didn't always have this luxury. You used to be a slave, but now you're free. Walter Brueggemann is an Old Testament scholar. He has a little book on Sabbath, and the book is called Sabbath as Resistance. And here we see that Sabbath really is resistance. It's resistance against a way of life that's exploitative and dehumanizing. Remember that that's your past, but it's not your present. So when Jesus says to the Pharisees, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, he's showing them that they've missed the point. They've missed the point of what the Sabbath was supposed to be from the beginning. They've been living in the second part of that statement. Their whole mindset is, let's do whatever we can to make sure that we don't break the Sabbath. That's the key thing. And if we're not sure, we'll just make a new rule. A new rule can just tell us whether we can or can't do that thing, so that we're always sure. We've got this fence, we don't even go near breaking the Sabbath. Know that the Sabbath is made for you, not the other way around. On the Sabbath, you get to join in with God's rhythm of work and then rest and delight. On the Sabbath, you get to stop and remember that you're not a slave anymore. The Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. But then Jesus goes further. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's a big, famous statement of Jesus. I think often gets misinterpreted in one of two ways. People are sometimes tempted to say, what this means is, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, which means he really, really cares about the Sabbath, and therefore you must keep the Sabbath. I think that's one way that people might misinterpret this. The second way is to say, well, Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath means Jesus has fulfilled the Sabbath, and so you don't need to keep it, because he's the Lord of it. He's fulfilled it. I think that's also a misinterpretation. Actually, what Jesus is saying is something much, much bigger about himself when he says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. As we've been reading through Mark's gospel so far, Mark has been building a picture of who Jesus is. And that's why this series is called Who Do You Say I Am? Because it's all about who Jesus is. And Mark is building this picture of who Jesus is. In chapter 1, verse 18, Jesus says, the kingdom of God has come near. And really what he means by that is, the kingdom has come near because I'm here. Like, I am God's kingdom come to you. And then chapter 2, verse 10, Jesus says, the Son of Man, which is himself, has authority on the earth to forgive sins. Everyone at the time who heard that knows that only God can say that. Only God has that authority. And now here in chapter 2, verse 28, Jesus says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. These three claims, being God's kingdom, having the authority to forgive sins, being Lord of something that is God's, are all things that are only true about God himself. Do you see what Jesus is doing? He's building this picture of who he is, making big, big claims about who he's come to be. He's saying, I'm the one, like, it's me. I'm the one you've been waiting for. I'm the God who's come to you. You've been so desperately trying to please God just by staying on the right side of the fence. But now I'm God who's come to you. At the start of chapter 3, we get a glimpse of what that means. What does it mean that God has come to us? And we'll look at this story from chapter 3 quite briefly. I've talked for too long about other things, so we'll do this quite briefly. But what does the start of chapter 3 show us? We're on another Sabbath, so still the Sabbath, but a different one. Jesus now is in the synagogue. There's a man with a shriveled hand. And the Pharisees are probably still annoyed about what Jesus has been saying. They probably have these big statements in their minds. This is a man who's claiming big things, blasphemous things. And the Pharisees are waiting to see what Jesus is going to do. It's tense. Jesus asks the man to stand up. And in verse 4 he says, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? The Pharisees say nothing. They haven't got an answer. And so Jesus heals him. And then this section of Mark's gospel ends with one of the big turning points in the whole book. Look at verse 6, the last verse that we had read to us. Because of Jesus healing someone, the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And one of the things that this section shows us is that Jesus has come to bring life even at the expense of his own. Look at the question that he asked in verse 4 again. Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or kill? Jesus has come to save lives. We get a little picture of that with this man's hand that goes from being shriveled to being restored. But we see that plan most clearly when the Pharisees' plan is complete. The Pharisees plot to kill Jesus, and ultimately they're successful, right? Their plotting works. They end up finding a way to kill Jesus. But as their plan is fulfilled, so is Jesus's. Jesus will say later on in Mark's Gospel, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve. And the way that he ultimately does that is by giving his life as a ransom for many. This little story of a man with the shriveled hands gives us a picture of Jesus, the God who's come to us to save lives, even if it costs him his own. So Jesus teaches us a few things. He teaches us that the Sabbath was made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. He teaches us that he is Lord of the Sabbath, and that is a huge claim. It means he's claiming to be God, and we see God's plan played out in the start of chapter 3. But I want to finish by thinking about a question that you might have as we have been thinking about the Sabbath. You might not have had this question, but the question that I really want to help us to think about as we finish is, what does that mean for Sabbath today? Is this one day of rest idea something that I, as a Christian, am supposed to do or not? And probably you know Christians who have different views on that. What is the answer to that question? In the one corner are the people who will say the Sabbath is still a binding commitment for all Christians. And they would say, well, look, all of the other 10 commandments, we would follow all of those as Christians. They haven't disappeared. Why is the Sabbath different? And they'll say that in this passage, Jesus is restoring the Sabbath. He's not getting rid of the Sabbath. And therefore, the Sabbath is still a binding commitment for Christians today. In the other corner are people who are saying, no, like the Sabbath is no longer a binding command. They'd use the fact that the Sabbath is the only one of the 10 commandments not explicitly repeated in the New Testament as part of the argument. They'd refer to some of Paul's writings that suggest that perhaps the Sabbath is not something that is binding anymore. So the question is, like, well, which is it? Like, is the Sabbath something I have to observe, or is it not? And I'm not going to answer that question. And I don't think that's a cop-out. And the reason I don't think it's a cop-out is because I don't think that's the question Jesus is trying to answer here. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that what Jesus is teaching us is that asking that question is the wrong question to ask. He's not answering the question, do I have to Sabbath or not? Instead, he's showing us that we get to Sabbath. And I think that answers the question in a much more fulfilling way. What Jesus said is that the Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. The Pharisees had missed the second part, hadn't they? Their mistake was that they saw themselves as in some ways being made for the Sabbath. Their whole life was geared around not falling short, not breaking the rules. It was another box that needed to be ticked. So let's make more and more rules so that we make sure that we tick the box. We make sure that we don't fall short. They lived as though they were made for the Sabbath. I don't think many of us have that problem. Like maybe some of us do, but I don't think many of us in the 21st century have that problem. I think for most of us, we miss the first part of the statement. We miss the fact that Sabbath was made for humanity. It's a gift to be enjoyed, not a box to be ticked. It's like if someone gave you a gift card for your favorite restaurant or your favorite shop, it would be a weird first question to say, just to check, do I have to spend this? It would be strange, wouldn't it, to say, do I have to spend this? If I gave you a gift card and your first question was, so do I have to use this? I'd probably be a bit confused. I probably wouldn't give you many more gift cards. I'd probably be like, oh, you don't seem that grateful for the gift that I've given you. The point is not, do you have to spend it or not? The point is that you get to. It's a gift. And so I want to finish just by really commending the practice of Sabbath, of stopping and resting for one day a week. I'm not going to say here the things that you must or mustn't do. I'm not even going to say what day of the week I think the Sabbath should be on. That's not the point that Jesus is trying to teach here. Jesus is doing something much, much bigger in terms of Sabbath and telling us in this passage how to Sabbath. What he's doing is he's reclaiming Sabbath from the Old Testament. He's restoring it from the legalism of the Pharisees, and he's recasting the vision for Sabbath based on his own life, death, and resurrection. If you do want some practical guidance about what Sabbath could look like, this is a really good book. It's called Garden City by John Mark Comer. He's got a podcast. He's got many podcasts, but one podcast is called the Rule of Life podcast. There's a whole series on Sabbath. And so if you want to think a bit more practically about what could Sabbath look like for me, this is a great place to go. But that's not our plan for today. Today is the big picture, reclaiming, restoring, recasting the vision for Sabbath that Jesus is doing in Mark chapter 2. If, and hopefully when, you Sabbath, you get to join in with the rhythm that has shaped the world since the beginning. Work, then rest and delight. Work, then rest and delight. I used to think that Sabbath was just about not working, about just stopping work for a day a week. And I've lived that rhythm for a number of years. Since at least I was at university, I'd spend a day a week not studying or doing work for university, and then as a teacher, not lesson planning or marking. I think that's good. But what I found was just the day got filled with like tidying and shopping and life admin and budgeting and all these other things that basically are work, they just don't get paid for. And so I now think it's a little bit, well, not a little, I think now it's much bigger than that. I think the Bible gives us a much bigger view of what Sabbath is, more than just stopping from your job for one day a week or whatever your main avenue of work is, whether it's paid or not. When the prophet Isaiah was writing to people who lost the vision of what Sabbath was, he writes, "If you call the Sabbath a delight, then your joy will be in the Lord." The Hebrew word Shabbat, which is the word we get Sabbath from, usually is translated stop or rest, but also because of that passage in Isaiah, is sometimes translated delight, like Sabbath is delight, which gives a whole new meaning to when Jesus says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. What he's saying, at least to some extent, is Jesus is Lord of delight. So when you cook a beautiful bit of roast beef or something else, or you're vegetarian, Jesus is Lord of the delight that you get when you eat it. When you go on a great walk, or when you watch the sunset, or when you switch off your phone and have a great time with close friends, when you have sex if you're married, Jesus is Lord of the delight. Sabbath is the time that's set aside for you to delight in all that is good in the world. Most of the world don't think that's what Christianity is about. But can you imagine if that's what people thought about the church? They're the people that really love to enjoy stuff. They're the people that have the best parties and cook the best food and seem to just appreciate things more than everybody else. Imagine if that's the picture of the church that the world got. That's basically what the Pharisees thought of Jesus. They've been arguing a lot in the first 2 chapters of Mark. They never accuse Jesus of being judgmental. They never say hypocritical. Well, that's probably the things that the church now gets, isn't it? Judgmental, hypocritical. That's never what Jesus was accused of. It was always about having too much fun and too much grace, far more than having too little. Imagine if that's what the world thought of the church. In the midst of work and commuting and parenting and budgeting and shopping and unread WhatsApp messages that seem to just build up and build up and build up, it's really easy to just miss that, isn't it? To miss that God is good and his world is good and life is good. And so the Sabbath is a day taken to remember that. And even though God is always good, the world isn't always good and life is not always good. And that's why Sabbath is often called a discipline. Even in those times, Sabbath is made for humanity to enter into the delight that God has put into our world. As you go home today, or however you get home, I'm pretty sure you'll pass some blossom on a tree somewhere. You might see it and delight in it, or you might drive straight past. It's there either way, isn't it? Just sometimes we need to stop to see it. So firstly, Sabbath is there for us to enjoy and delight in God's world. And secondly, Sabbath is made for humanity to remind us that we're free. Remember that Sabbath command from Deuteronomy, the same as the first bit from Exodus, but the reason for observing the Sabbath was different. It was remember that you used to be a slave in Egypt. This is Adam Peaty. He's a British swimmer. He's the world record holder in the 50 and 100 meter breaststroke events. Over the past couple of years, he's taken time away from swimming. He's talked quite openly about his depression, about alcohol abuse. You might have seen this on BBC Sport last week. He has recently become a Christian, and he's talked really quite movingly about his testimony. This is what he says. He said, "I spent most of my life kind of validating, getting my gratification or life fulfillment from my results, and that led me to some really dark moments. And it's really living your life on a quantifiable measure of results." And you know, he is the best there has ever been at what he does. Like, no one has ever swum breaststroke faster than him. And yet still it wasn't enough. He's won 3 Olympic gold medals, but he says, a gold medal is the coldest thing you'll ever wear. It's the coldest thing because you think it will fix all of your problems, but it won't. And if you're anything like Adam Peaty or anything like me, there's probably a voice somewhere inside of you that's saying that you need to work harder, that you need to be better if you want to measure up, and that gratification and fulfillment will come if you just work hard enough to make some achievement that is just over the hill. I don't know what it is that you're working towards at the moment, your paid work or outside of it, but you could become the best in the world at it. You could become the best there has ever been, and that still might not be enough. Take it from someone who's been there that it doesn't work like that. But having become a Christian, he now says he swims with liberation and freedom. Those are the 2 words he chose. Liberation and freedom. And that is a great picture of what Sabbath is like. Sabbath is a resistance against a world that wants more and more from us. And it's resistance against the voices in our own heads that tell us that we need to achieve more and more and more in order to measure up. For the Israelites, their freedom came from the Exodus, that escape from Egypt. For us, the Exodus is a picture. It's not our reality, it's a picture. It's a picture that points us to the death and resurrection of Jesus. In John's Gospel, Jesus was talking to a different group of Pharisees. What he says to them is, "You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Quite a famous statement of his. And these Pharisees were confused. They said, we're children of Abraham. We've never been slaves. How can you say the truth will set you free? What does that mean? And Jesus says, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And that word sin just means to fall short or mess up. Like, everyone who messes up is a slave to messing up. But then he says, but if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. It's easy to forget that, isn't it, when life is kind of pulling you in multiple directions. But if you're a Christian, then the Son has set you free. And if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. If you're a Christian, then you don't owe anyone. Not your boss, not your family, not yourself, not God. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And Sabbath is the day when you preach that truth, or you get to preach that truth to your mind and to your body. Remember that you used to be slaves in Egypt, but God brought you out. Remember that the Son has set you free, and if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. And so, to finish, the Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. I think it's one thing, definitely for me, to believe that and hear. It's another thing, isn't it, to live that out week by week, living out these truths in our lives. I think that's the challenge and the invitation that Jesus gives us in this section of Mark 2. If we believe that, our lives will change, won't they? That's the invitation. So let me pray and then we'll finish. Father God, thank you that we can know that if you say you set us free, then we are free indeed. Lord, would that truth go deep into our hearts? Would it give us reassurance? Would it give us confidence? Would we live with liberation and freedom because it's true? Lord, would you give us the confidence to live differently, to take time to rest because we know that you are in control, because we know that you have set us free. Lord, I pray for particularly anyone who knows that in their head but doesn't know it in their heart. Lord, would you really deepen that truth in all of us, that if you say we are free, then we are free indeed. Amen.
If we can stand.